Hey everyone, I'm Rick Becker, host of the Irish Baseball Podcast, joined today by Ben Anderson. Ben, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks, Rick. Sure appreciate the invite.
So, you have written a number of books in multiple different series that have a lot to do with Irish and Scottish folklore. So, why don't you talk, sort of give us a broad overview on all of your books, and then we'll get into some specifics in a little bit.
Yeah, sounds good. So the book series is called the McGunnegal Chronicles, and the stories take place in Ireland in the 1840s, kind of during the Irish famine. And um, these two kids discover that their grandpa has been hiding a secret down in the potato cellar. And it turns out he has a relic from a lost age of Ireland. And the kids stumble into this thing and they suddenly find themselves in the world of the others, where these creatures of Irish legends still live on. So there are leprechauns and goblins and fairies and giants and trolls and so forth, all the legendary creatures. And they end up going on all kinds of adventures. So the stories begin in Ireland, and then as the series progresses through, I'm working on book 8 now. So as the series goes on, they encounter new adventures, and I try to weave in as many Irish fairy tales and legends as I can, as well as Welsh and Scottish and some Norse as well.
So, while these are fantasy books and they are obviously fiction, you are researching a lot of history to go into this, and it sort of takes a lot of knowledge of Irish culture. So we like to highlight people who are preserving Irish culture. And even though you are writing something that is fiction, in a way, you are preserving that culture.
Yeah, I do try to set the real historical context. So it's during the Irish famine that lasted roughly from 1845 into the early 1850s, so 1850 to 1852-ish. There's different numbers that I've seen as far as when the famine actually ended, but that's kind of the historical context of the series as well. And I try to weave that in. These are meant for middle grade and older audience, so I try not to be too graphic, even though that famine was very graphic. It was very terrible. A million people died or left, and lots of bad things happened. But I try to do it in a way, present it in a way that's acceptable to kids as well as adults too. So yeah, definitely that's the historical context. So I try to weave in a little bit of things that were going on in both Ireland and as far as like the British government and their response to the famine and things like that too. So there's both sides. So maybe a little bit of historical fantasy, going on with the real world context, and then of course the fantasy world as well.
So, how much research do you have to put into all of these books?
It really never stops. It's an ongoing thing. I've tried to research as many, not just the historical context, and read about the Irish famine and the things that were going on, especially like down in Skibbereen in southern Ireland, where there are mass graves where there's estimates I've seen 20,000 people buried in this one mass grave in that area. So definitely research on the historical side of things. But then there's this whole world of Celtic lore that you really never stop learning about as well. And even some of it goes into uh, little legends that you encounter in like travel diaries of people from the 1800s or newspapers and things like that. So there are always these little fragments of things that can be woven into the stories as well. So it takes a lot of research, a lot of thought, and you can take a little bit of artistic license, but I try to keep the flavor of those legends as true to form as possible.
What do you think those legends tell us about the people who were living in Ireland at the time that they came up with these legends and they continued to pass them down? These things don't exist in a vacuum, right? They serve a purpose. they explain something that the people couldn't explain at the time, or they are intended to scare kids or whatever. Like there is a purpose to all of these legends. What do you think that they do tell us about the Irish people and the Scottish people and the Norse people as you expand into different legends?
Yeah, I don't think it's isolated just to the Celtic peoples, but really people all around the world have um, I think a need or a just a basic desire to understand the mysteries that exist in life. And some of these legends and so forth may have been come up with, if you would, or experienced in a way to explain those mysteries, the mysteries of nature and our connection to nature. There, in the Irish mythologies, for example, you have the Tuatha De Danann and you have the Fomorians, kind of the gods, if you would, of light and darkness or order and chaos. And so perhaps to explain some of why in life we have order and chaos simultaneously existing and law and outlaw and all those sorts of things. Um, and so maybe there's some of that going on, but the legends, some of the legends really go back pretty far, pretty deep in time, and even further than have been written down. A lot of these came from oral traditions, and where those originated, who knows? Way back, perhaps in time, the legends of the Fomorians and the Tuatha De Danann, in the legends themselves, go back in prehistory. So um, it's said that there were something like five or six different people groups that inhabited Ireland over the many centuries, even millennia. And the Tuatha De Danann were one of those, and the Fomorians were one of those, and the Firbolg were one of those. So there are all these different people groups, and they warred with each other. Sometimes they intermarried and they mingled. And there's a lot to say about those legends and those mythologies that speak to, I think, the human heart, the human person, to try to say things about us as humanity as well as humans.
When you decided that this was the way that you wanted to go with your creative outlets and you decided these are the stories that you needed to tell, why was that? What drew you to Irish folklore, Scottish folklore? Like you said, I mean, every culture has it. So, what drew you specifically to these stories?
Well, my great great grandma, whose name was Ellen McGunnegal, she it said that when she was in her 90s, she could still dance an Irish jig. So that was always a fun family story. And so when my mom was telling us those stories as we were growing up, she also would read us fairy tales and tell us stories, read us fables and so forth. So it was kind of always in my blood, if you would, the idea of telling, hearing stories like this. And of course, growing up with Disney with Seven Dwarves and which were based on other, real, not real, but real legends from uh, European legends. Those were always fun to me too. So when my kids came along, this was over 20 years ago, I was telling them stories. I was making up bedtime stories and weaving in fairy tales and little pictures of Ireland as much as I could. And it kind of stretched out into this year-long bedtime story. And my wife said, you ought to write this down one day. So I started fiddling with that idea, just kind of jotting down things. And after like, I don't know, 7 years or so, I started getting more serious. Like, okay, I think I'm going to do this thing. And then in 2013, published the first three books actually, and then went on to write the others as well. Did audiobooks and working with artists and things like that. So that's kind of the where these things started out.
Now, I have run into you a number of times. This is why I asked you to be on the show at different Irish festivals. And it's kind of an interesting dynamic when you're an author, right? You can be at an Irish festival as somebody who makes a product, and you can show people like, here's the sweater I made, or here's the hat that I made, or here's the jewelry. Or you can be a musician and get up on stage at one of these Irish festivals and say, here's a couple of my songs. I have CDs for sale, or I have flash drives for sale, or whatever. But as an author, how do you communicate with people when you're meeting them at an Irish festival and you're trying to say, this is a book. I can't read you the book right now because, first of all, then you'd already have heard the story. But how do you get people interested in the stories while you don't have necessarily the best platform like some of the other artists who are appearing at these events?
Yeah, a couple ways. Every once in a while, I have an opportunity to do a talk, and so I'll tell some Irish legends or Scottish legends or something like this, and then talk about my books just a little bit. And people like that. It's a good opportunity to share just some Celtic lore and then kind of show how that weaves into my own stories. But at the table, when you got, multiple people just kind of hanging around, and they want to move on, they don't want to spend 30 minutes with you. So that you've got like 20 seconds, to tell your little pitch. And so what we started out with, Grandpa's been hiding a secret down in the potato cellar. Those few words are like something people say, well, what was he hiding? So that you get a little bit more interest that way, and you've got a few minutes to just chat with people. And sometimes too, people are really interested in just talking. That they're trying to write a book, or they're making a film, or they write poetry or songs or whatever. And it's just nice to talk to people who are fellow artists. So that happens quite a bit. Almost every show I'm at, there are a few people that come and say, "Well, how did you do this? How did you publish your books?" and so forth. And it's always good to share, fun to share my own experience. So you have that 20 seconds, and then that might develop into something else, something larger.
So, we like to highlight Irish history a lot on this show, and Irish American history, Irish immigrant history, and of course, history dating back to actually the island of Ireland. And I think a lot of people know some of the different, revolutions. They know 1916, they know the potato famine, they know later in the 19th century when there were some uprisings, they know hurling, they know Irish music. But I think these folk traditions, and maybe they know about fairies or they know about some of these other traditions, but it's more abstract. They don't know the names, the dates, and the details like they do some of the actual pieces of history. So, if you were to talk to somebody who does have Irish heritage and is very interested in it, how would you sell them on wanting to know the folklore and not just the date history?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess different people have different interests, of course, and but I think someone that's interested in Ireland kind of comes as this package, I think. It feels like the legends, um the lore, the fairy tales, the landscape really is part of the DNA, if you would, of the country of Ireland. And even there are hundreds, for example, just one example, there are hundreds of holy wells in Ireland. And most of them are dedicated to some sort of saint, Saint Bridget or whoever, Saint Patrick's Well. And I've been to some of those wells there in Ireland as well as in Cornwall and different places around the UK. And it's almost like there's this term called the Synaxarian, which is kind of like the entire bibliography of the saints, if you would, in paper form and in books. And so there are whole volumes of saints, these stories about the saints. And there are Irish saints and there are Scottish saints, loads of Scottish saints, and British saints, and from Saint David of Wales and so forth, all the various Celtic nations. And it's almost like there's a Synaxarian written in stone across Ireland and across the Celtic world in these holy wells. So to really get Ireland, I think it's valuable, very valuable to see how the earth itself, if you would, these holy wells, these springs and so forth that are named after the saints, really support the Irish culture, that the land itself is doing that. And you can go from, holy well, you can do pilgrimages even. And some of them I've been to, for example, not in Ireland, but in Cornwall, there's St. Nun's Well, which is in kind of south central Cornwall. And book 4 of my series actually sort of ends at that well, this holy well. But there are stories that are mingled in with the stories of the saints of like pixies and creatures that are living in these wells. So I try to weave that into my books too. So there's predating Christianity. Some of these sites were um, still had stories that were not Christian stories, but were stories about various creatures, pixies or leprechauns or whatever that inhabited these wells. So that's part of the package of Ireland too, is both the pre-Christian era and the Christian era and the modern day world of how Ireland is progressing with AI and all kinds of things as a technological society. But it's still all one big package. So I think anyone interested in Ireland should take it as a whole. There's lots there.
And you mentioned that you also include some Norse folklore and some Norse history. And obviously, a lot of people know about the Viking attacks in Ireland and how there were a lot of Norse people who sort of found themselves joining the Irish population. And then there was, a commingling there. Did that extend a lot to the folklore? As the Norse people came to Ireland with not great intentions, but then some of them ended up staying. And I would imagine a lot of those stories ended up weaving their way into the Celtic stories, and a lot of those traditions ended up staying in Ireland.
Yeah, yeah, they definitely did. Just to give a couple of examples, there's there are stories, for example, the Giant's Causeway up in Northern Ireland. Beautiful place. If you have a chance to go, it's just a wonderful place to visit. My wife and I went there a few years back. And there's a whole legend around the Giant's Causeway and why it's called the Giant's Causeway. And that is that this giant, and some say it was the giant Finn McCool. And by the way, Finn McCool stands large in Irish legendary, in the culture there. And sometimes he's a giant in some of the legends, and sometimes he's a human being, a man. And so there's this weird mingling of tales that comes about. But there's a whole story about how he built the Giant's Causeway to get over to Scotland to fight one of his rival giants. And when he found out the giant was too big to handle, then he there's a whole story about him pretending to be a baby and his wife tricking the giant from Scotland. And then when the giant from Scotland thought that Finn McCool, the baby, was actually the baby. He thought, well, Finn McCool must be a huge giant. So he ran across the Giant's Causeway and destroyed it on his way. So Finn McCool couldn't chase him. And so, so there's, but the idea of giants is very big in the Norse mythology. They're the frost giants, and I guess if you've ever seen some of the Thor movies, and so forth. They kind of bring those in to the picture. But also in Scotland, in the Orkney Islands. There's a lot of legends that deal with Vikings coming into those lands, and there's like an eternal battle that takes place on the island of Hoy, which is also in my books. So a lot of influence of those legends that came from Norway or from Scandinavian lands, as those peoples came and brought their legends with them, they kind of mingled with the Celtic legends that existed in Scotland and Ireland and so forth.
So you say that a lot of people come up to the table and talk about how they want to write a book. And you had an option. We've had a lot of people on the Irish Baseball podcast over the years who have written a book. They had an idea. Maybe it was an old baseball player that knew their grandmother and they wanted to make sure that the heritage of that player, the story of that player didn't get lost to time. So they wrote a book. They did a lot of research, put it together. You went into this with a much more ambitious idea. You were telling your kids these stories, and they say if there's a book that you want to read and you can't find it, then it's your responsibility to write it. And you decided to do that. But instead of just compiling these stories in one book, you have created this huge series. Now, was that your intent from the very beginning? Or did you write that first book and decide, I have so much more I want to say? And then it led to the bigger series.
Yeah, definitely the latter. When I started out, I was doing it for fun, and I'd always loved writing ever since I was a kid, but I'd never really seriously tackled it. So I started out writing the story for my kids and thinking, well, maybe somebody else will read it too. But the stories kind of write themselves in a way. You start out with an idea, at least me, and you don't exactly know where it's going. So when I finished the first three books, that first trilogy is a complete story in and of itself. Then there's an epilogue in book three that I added to lead into the next trilogy. And there's an epilogue in book six that leads to the next trilogy that I'm working on. So you really don't know for sure exactly where it's going to lead. And now with a trilogy of trilogies, I think that's going to be it for this series, and then I'll spin off something else. But it really started out with just as an idea, something fun to do with the kids and something to pass on to their kids. And then it grew into something bigger. So it definitely was an evolution of ideas. And the more I learned, the more I realized there's so much more to go. I can tell lots of stories through this genre of Irish fantasy, Celtic fantasy.
And when you are weaving the real history into these stories, and you are dealing with fantasy, but you're dealing with, as we mentioned before, a really difficult moment in time. So, how do you balance the seriousness of the time frame you're dealing with in these stories with some of the more fanciful elements? Obviously, a lot of this folklore isn't just, rainbows and puppies, but you are still dealing with something that is so serious. And do you have to make the conscious effort to say, I have to stick to at least a tone where we're acknowledging the horror that these kids were dealing with while also addressing these more fanciful areas?
Yeah, there's a general rule of writing that says show don't tell. So you want to use a picture, a scene, a particular encounter, or whatever it might be, to express what you're saying more than just kind of lecturing or preaching or something. So in that regard, with the famine, I try to show, for example, as they're walking through a town, they meet an old man and his shoes are just falling apart and things like that. And he's waiting to get a penny. so that he can feed his sick wife. Those sorts of scenes express what's happening without you having to show gore and the horrors. That it really was a lot of gore. There was a lot of horror, children dying and things like that. And another example is the characters are going into the town and they meet a woman who's kind of in rags with her little girl, and they put her in the wagon. They ask her, "Where's your husband?" And the little girl says, "Daddy went to heaven." And they're just dejected. So those sorts of scenes that express the sadness, express the death, express the hunger, the destitution of the people, you can do in a way that's not too graphic, but gets the point across. And then you can leave that scene behind and go on to other things. But so periodically, you want to weave in the reality of the situation without being overly graphic so that it's not appropriate for kids.
And you said that you started these stories as just stories that you would tell to your kids, and then you wanted to jot them down. So you had a record, and then that turned into you creating this book series. How important was it for you to make sure that the main characters were kids? Because if you're telling a story to kids, I think sometimes adults have a tendency to still center the story on adults, but try to have it be kid friendly in the rest of the content. But you realized that for kids to really appreciate these stories, you wanted to center them through the children.
Yeah, that was important to me. And one of my daughters, I have four kids, and one of my girls, she always claimed that she was Colleen in the books. So she really identified with that character. And my other daughter loves animals. She loves horses. And there's a girl, Abby, one of the sisters in the stories that loves animals and horses and so forth. So I tried to weave into the characters in the books, kind of little characteristics of my own children as well. So especially the girls, because they're the ones I mainly told these to. And I told another whole another set of stories to the boys, but I'd sit in the hallway and tell the stories out loud so they could both hear. But the girls seemed to like the McGunnegal Chronicles the best.
Do you think that putting together these stories has connected you more with, like you said, your great grandmother who could do an Irish jig at 90? Does it make you feel more a part of your Irish heritage because you have done all this research? And now that you have these books published, you are going to Irish festivals all the time, and you are really putting yourself in the culture more than maybe you would have had you not written these books.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really the books that led me to, or inspired me, I guess, to go to Ireland and go to the UK and visit these various legendary sites that I weave into the stories. So for sure, it's been a great adventure to write about them, research them online and so forth, but even more to go and meet the Irish people. Like there's one place called the Giant's Grave. It's actually a dwarf's grave, and that's woven in book four as well. And so my wife and I, we trying to find this place, and we went and couldn't find it. And one of the neighbors just drove up and said, "Hey, can I help you out?" And we started talking about it. And he says, "Oh yeah, that's on my neighbor's land. Let me take you there." So he took us and we went down to the giant's grave and got our picture taken. We talked about the stories, and he says, "Oh, hey, why don't you come to my house and we'll have some tea?" So it's total stranger. The Irish people are just so friendly. So we went and we had tea and bread and jam and met his mom. And then he said, "You know about the fort?" I said, "No, what fort?" And he says, "Let me show you." So we got in his truck and we went out drove down this dirt road and found a fairy fort and just talked about that and just amazing people. So being able to connect not just through research, but through being there, seeing the sites, meeting the people, the neighbors, and becoming friends. And it's really has connected me with Ireland in many ways.
So you mentioned that people will ask you about writing their own books. What advice would you have for somebody who has a story somewhere that they want to get out of them and they want to get started on the same journey that you have started?
First of all, just write, just do it. Take 10 minutes a day, whatever it is, and start writing things down. Even if it's not coherent, if it's just ideas, collect those ideas, put them in a drawer, put them on your computer, something. And then once you've got a story, and make sure it's a real story and not just like a bunch of scenes or a bunch of scenarios, but think of the story. Where's the arc? There's always an A story and a B story. The A story is the action, the adventure, all that sort of thing. And the B story is the character growth and the character arc throughout the whole story. Get those two things together and and then find somebody, a writing partner who will give you some honest feedback and be willing to take that honest feedback. Sometimes it's really hard. My editor is has become one of my best friends, and we go hiking together and stuff, but he's willing to really give me hard feedback and say, "Are you sure you really want to do this?" Because he's read all the books too. So that's really important to just start, just do it, find somebody who will partner with you just to be a collaborator on your writing, and then use some platform to publish it.
So, Ben, you've written these books. We've had a conversation now for probably about a half hour at this point. Let's say you have now sold somebody on your book series. How can they go and purchase these books, have them sent to their house?
Yeah, just go on Amazon and look up the McGunnegal Chronicles or my name, and you'll see the McGunnegal Chronicles out there. And yeah, just buy them online, and or you can shoot me an email if you have my email address. Feel free to share it if you do that sort of thing. Um, and I can send you a signed copy.
Absolutely. Ben Anderson, thank you so much for being a part of the Irish Baseball Podcast.
Oh, thanks so much. I sure appreciate it, Rick.